The title of this sermon is See All the People, and it's got a hashtag in front of it. It's the name of our new worship series going on for the next 4 weeks. The rest of the title, it's See All the People, the Pressing Crowd, and it's based on Luke 5, verses 1 through 11. Will you pray with me for a moment, please? Lord, for the sake of all living things, may my words not be trite. For the sake of all living things, may your word be heard. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer, you, not me. Amen. No, the haunting voice says, quietly at first. No, it continues, as its wail starts to grow louder. No, it insists, as the room begins to shake and a portrait on the wall starts to come unhinged. No, no, the voice demands, as urgently as possible, as the room begins to disintegrate and the picture spins around, and our hero, befuddled by all the commotion, stands disheveled in the middle of the room. The violence ceases after a moment, with the room destroyed and the portrait crooked and hanging by a thread. All I wanted, our hero pleads eventually, repeating his line that began the scene. All I wanted was just a little sign. And that's what happens to Steve Martin in the movie The Man with Two Brains. Came out about 1984, I believe. He's widowed in the movie, and he wonders if he should now marry a vixen, played by Kathleen Turner. If you remember most movies from the 80s with Kathleen Turner, she was usually playing a vixen who was up to no good. That was the case here. Now, to get his answer in this movie, Steve Martin approaches a portrait of his late wife, and he asks for just a little sign, but he doesn't really want to see. He doesn't want to see the sign in what he gets, no matter how obvious it is. Now, the fishermen here in Luke 5, they get a big sign, don't they? They weren't expecting to catch any fish on this shift, but they get a sign so big that not even 2 boats can handle it. And it's not the first sign for Simon either. Now, in this passage, Peter is referred to as Simon, hence my mispronunciation a moment ago. Peter is referred to as Simon, so I'm going to refer to him as Simon, because that's what he's called here. He's called Simon Peter eventually. But for right now, I'm going to say that this is not the first sign for Simon. Because if we go back a little ways in Luke, we're only in the 5th chapter here. If we go back a little ways in Luke, we know that Jesus has already been to Simon's house in Capernaum, that Simon apparently heard Jesus speak and invited him to come home afterwards. And when they get to Simon's home, they find out that his mother-in-law is sick. And Jesus heals her, and she gets up and starts to serve them, which was a pretty radical move on the Sabbath. That's for another Sunday. But this is not the first time that Simon has seen a sign from Jesus. He saw one earlier when Jesus healed his mother-in-law. So obviously the two men know who each other is. Now, that was one side. But here the fishermen, not just Simon, all the fishermen, get a really big sign. Probably all the people on the shore who heard Jesus speak see this great big sign too. Now Simon, kind of surprisingly, is frightened by all this, thinking that he was a fisherman, pretty much invested in his career. Thinking he was a fisherman, if Simon saw Jesus be responsible for this catch of such a great catch of fish, that it almost sinks 2 boats, you don't think Simon would be frightened. You think Simon instead would say, Lord, come fishing with us every day. We always want to take in a haul like this, so Lord Jesus, please come fishing with us every day so that this happens all the time. We might expect Simon, having seen this sign, to have such a reaction. But instead of saying that, what Luke tells us Simon says to Jesus instead is, Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. And that seems strange because Simon was never one to pass up on an opportunity. At least Peter wasn't. In a few weeks, when we look at the Transfiguration, We'll hear again about how they're on the mountaintop after Elijah and Moses appeared to Jesus and were talking to him. How when the disciples, Peter, James, and John, could speak again, Peter said, Lord, it is good for us to be here. Let us build 3 tabernacles so everyone can come see. He was capitalizing on that opportunity then. It almost seems strange that Simon, Peter, doesn't capitalize on this opportunity now. He could invite Jesus to go fishing with him all the time, but instead he says, Lord, depart from me. Go away from me, for I am a sinful man. Let's imagine for just a moment having the opportunity of inviting Jesus to be with us and to work with us, alongside us every day. If we had that opportunity, what would we do? Would we tell the Lord to stay with us and work with us? Or like Simon, would we tell the Lord to go? Would we say, you must leave me, Lord? Would we say, Lord, please stay off of my property because I am a sinful man? Or would we ask Jesus to stay with us and work with us? Maybe the answer is more complicated than it appears at first blush. When we have the opportunity to say to the Lord, stay or go, really, do we ask him to stay, or do we, like Simon, tell him to leave because we're fearful of our own status? See, Simon knows, as the other fishermen do, as all the crowd did that day. Simon knows, along with everyone who witnessed this scene, that this is the Lord before him, that Jesus is God made flesh. I don't deserve anything this good, is what Simon says to Jesus here. Yet Jesus says to him in response, do not be afraid. He knows what's going on with Simon. He knows what's going on with all of us. And to Simon, he says, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people. And just like that, all the fishermen who were all pretty much invested in their careers, who had this partnership, this operation going, that had more than one boat and more than one crew. Just like that, these fishermen who are so invested in their careers leave everything and follow Jesus. See, they have seen enough to convict them to leave everything and to follow Jesus and to start catching people because they have just seen such a great sign. Have we seen such a sign? Do we have a conviction similar to the one that the fishermen have here? Do we acknowledge that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is God made flesh, that he is God with us? Are we as convicted as these fishermen that Jesus is the Messiah, or are we, like Steve Martin in the movie The Man with Two Brains, standing in a demolished room still asking for just a little sign? You know, the invitation stands. Daunting as it might be, and as reluctant as we might be, as tired as we might be, the invitation for us to follow Jesus and start catching people, that still stands. See, Simon and his partners had fished all night and caught nothing. And Luke tells us now that they're mending their nets, and from what I've read, these were likely trammel nets, which were probably hundreds of yards long. Who would want to clean fishing nets that are hundreds of yards long? Think about it. How do you think that maintenance went? How do you think it was going that morning? What I was trying to imagine was if these nets were hundreds of yards long and they hadn't caught any fish, I wonder if the nets were so dirty and so filthy, scales, what have you. I wonder if they were so filthy that really no fish could even get into them. I was trying to imagine what that might have looked like, and I was trying to imagine the work of cleaning nets hundreds of yards long after a fruitless night of fishing. Try and imagine what that was like. And on top of that, imagine what it must have been like if suddenly this rabbi comes along and says to us, this crowd is so big that I cannot teach them for here. And then he sits down in our boat without any kind of invitation or permission, and he says to us, cast out from the shoreline. What are we going to do? Well, if we're like Simon, if we know Jesus on some level already, we're probably going to listen to him, and we have to think about Jesus' powers of persuasion. Now, see, we've heard Jesus speak if we're in Simon's shoes. We've had him at our house, and yes, he has healed our mother-in-law. And so we listen. Even when he gets in our boat and says, push out a little way, we might be a little bothered since we've been fishing all night. But even if we're a little bothered, the thing is, he's going to bother us more. Because after we've done that, after we've pushed out, he's going to tell us to do something. He's not going to ask us the second time. He's going to tell us what to do. He's going to tell us to put out into the deep water. And let's face it, the deep water, we just don't want to go there. We don't want to go. We don't want to do it. But he has another sign for us, and it's no little sign. It is a great sign. So many fish being caught that it starts to sink 2 boats. And if we're like Simon and we say to this Lord, depart from me, for I am sinful, he's still going to say to us, do not be afraid. He's not going to ask us this time. He's just going to say to us, from now on, you will be catching people. A few weeks ago, last month on January 6th, we talked about pronouns from another passage in Isaiah 60. We talked about when the Bible uses words like you. And in the 6 verses from Isaiah 60 that we read back on January 6th, the words you and your, the pronouns, appeared 15 times in those 6 verses. Isaiah was particular with his pronouns. Luke likewise is particular with his pronouns here, something we'll see again next week when we look at Luke 6. But notice Jesus's choice of pronouns here, because what he says is this: do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people. You, he says, and he means you. Now, he says this knowing what we've seen. He says this knowing what we've read. He says to us, whether we see this or hear it, he says to us, from now on, you will be catching people. He says this knowing that we know that he is the Messiah, the healer, the Savior, God made flesh and God with us. And knowing that we know all this, he says to us, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people. And he also says to us, put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch. When he says this to us, what do we say? Do we say we're tired? Do we say we've been working long and hard all night and we have nothing to show for it? I mean, let's face it, if we're like Simon, we have a mess on our hands here. And he shows up unannounced and uninvited. And he makes himself at home in one of our boats at the end of a long work day for us. He asks us to set out once, then he tells us to set out again, and then he tells us we're going to start catching people. I mean, we've seen it all. We've heard it all that the fishermen have seen and heard. And having seen all this and having heard all this, are we falling on our knees and saying, go away from me to Jesus? Or are we working with him? Are we following him? Are we leaving everything and following him, taking him up on his invitation to catch people? Is that how we're responding to him? Or are we taking the opportunity that we have and of asking him to stay and telling him to go instead? What is our response to Jesus' saying? Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people. Amen. Thanks be to God.